Israel's parliament has voted in favor of a new coalition government, ending Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's historic 12-year rule. The G7 nations group has wrapped up the busiest day of the three-day summit. At least 12 people have been killed and 37 seriously injured after a gas explosion at a residential neighborhood in central China. Hello and welcome to TeleSUR. I'm José Daniel Lopez in Quito, Ecuador, and this is from the south. Amid protests, the G7 nations group has wrapped up the busiest day of the three-day summit, having discussed a path out of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as foreign policy and climate change. The G7 leaders are expected to issue a closing declaration promising more financial support for developing countries hit by the climate crisis and funds for infrastructure projects in the developing world. Additionally, the G7 leaders meeting in Cornwall are to adopt strict measures on coal-fired power stations as part of the battle against climate change and are expected to set out plans to reduce emissions from farming, transport, and the making of steel and cement.
There remained a small number of hunter-gatherers.
And during the last day of the summit, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has announced that the G7 wealthy nations have pledged over 1 billion coronavirus vaccine doses for poorer nations, half of them coming from the United States.
A week ago, I asked my fellow leaders to help in preparing and providing the doses we need to vaccinate the whole world by the end of 2022. I'm very pleased to announce that this weekend leaders have pledged over 1 billion doses, either directly or through funding to COVAX. That includes 100 million from the UK to the world's poorest countries, which is another big step towards vaccinating the world. And that's in addition to everything scientists and governments and the pharmaceutical industry have done so far to roll out one of the largest vaccination programs in history.
On the other hand, social activists on Sunday dismissed the pledge from the G7 nations group to donate 1 billion vaccine doses to poor countries. They said it was nowhere near enough to stop global pandemic.
You know, it's funny that the communique says they will do everything they can as fast as possible, and then they talk about 1 year, 1 billion in the next 1 year. It's quite interesting to see how they think that 1 billion doses for 1 year would actually end the pandemic. That's really funny because that would not even take care of 5% of the population. And so it's kind of disappointing because the whole world was really looking up to this richest country that come together, hoping that they could mobilize as a group, you know, to really try to end the pandemic on time. Because the longer it stays, of course, the whole world suffers from that. But we just believe that this is inadequate. It doesn't show the urgency that is required.
The G7 group meeting in Britain have reached an agreement Sunday on different topics like the coronavirus pandemic, climate change, the global economy, and foreign policy. However, climate activists say the agreement was not enough. Extinction Rebellion climate protesters have demonstrated in Cornwall on the last day of the G7 summit. Although they hope to see Joe Biden to put the United States back on track, they are disappointed by the lack of action to tackle climate change and demand leaders to stop subsidizing fossil fuels.
We just aren't in the space of promises anymore. There are things that people can do immediately. No more subsidies of fossil fuels. End of. Stop it, you know? And they haven't been making these kind of decisive moves to get us off this fossil fuel nightmare. And, you know, the repairs to nature have to be done through the farming and food system. I'm not hearing them talking like leaders who understand the crisis that we're in.
South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has called for a waiver on coronavirus vaccine patents. Speaking at the G7 summit in England, the African leader reiterated that the waiver will allow African nations and other countries like India to produce enough vaccines for their people who are in desperate need of them.
And we argued that, as South Africa and India have proposed, we should waive the TRIPS process or measure at the WTO, and what we got here is a commitment that, yes, the negotiations should ensue at the WTO. We're rather pleased with this, having amassed more than 100 countries as South Africa and India in support of our proposals. We think there's been progress in the form of enabling the negotiations to happen on the text that should be looked at by all countries.
In other news, talks between Iran and world powers on reviving the 2015 Iran nuclear deal could be resumed in Vienna. Senior diplomats from China, Germany, France, Russia, and Britain made it a hotel in the Austrian capital for the talks. The discussions are aimed at attempting to restore the landmark 2015 agreement to contain Iranian nuclear development, which had been abandoned by the United States during the Trump administration. The U.S. is not formally part in the Vienna meetings, but President Joe Biden's administration has recently expressed willingness to rejoin the deal under terms that will see the U.S. scale back sanctions imposed on Iran.
If we need maybe a couple of weeks to clean up the existing text, to remove square brackets around relatively secondary topics, and concentrate on the main things. The main topic at this stage is how the agreement will be implemented, who will do what and when.
At least 12 people have been killed and 37 seriously injured after a gas explosion at a residential neighborhood in central China. Images supplied by Chinese media show rescue workers climbing over broken concrete slabs to reach people still trapped inside. Investigations into the cause of the explosion were still going on. The explosion comes a day after 8 people were killed, another 3 others injured in an accident at a chemical facility in Guyana province.
As of 14 hours, the city's party committee and government have deployed 2,000 rescuers to carry out the search and rescue operation. A total of 913 households have been evacuated, and 138 injured people have been sent to hospital for treatment, 37 of whom are severely injured. 12 people died.
Thousands of protesters marched to the streets of Paris and other French cities on Saturday against the country's far-right activists. Unions, associations, and left-wing political parties in France called for demonstrations around the country a week before local elections and ahead of next year's presidential election, which is widely expected to once again put a far-right candidate, Marine Le Pen, in the final round. France's left has lost its political voice amid divisions since Macron won the presidency in 2017 against his far-right opponent Le Pen.
Letting the far-right talking in media, in newspaper, or even during the election, letting them all the place and all the opportunity to spread the idea of the far-right, that leads to people to think that the ideas of the far-right is okay, but it's not. Like, it's not, especially in Europe, where there is a lot of really difficult history that we went through during the past 100 years, and now we are going back to this here in France.
When you see the actual president taking the ideas of the far right and making them just average, and he's making a statement that is going to harm the whole country by saying that it's okay to have those kind of ideas. He was elected as a man who is neither right nor left, and we can clearly see what it's meaning. So now we are saying we are the left, and we want to gather the left around the idea of non-racism, anti-homophobia, and anti-sexism.
More news in a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back. The Copa America tournament, postponed from last year due to the coronavirus pandemic, will kick off today in Brazil. However, this decision sparked some controversy with the national team as well as with local people, after Brazil has reported the second highest COVID-19 death toll in the world. Our correspondent Brian Mir has more information in the following report.
The Copa America, or America's Cup, is kicking off today in Brazil, in the Mané Garrincha Stadium in Brasilia, the national capital. This is a very controversial event this year, as the players initially promised to boycott it because of the risk of COVID-19 transmission, but then backed down at the last minute. Now, according to a study by Congresso em Foco, the Brazilian political site, only 15% of the residents in the cities where the Copa America is taking place have been fully vaccinated against COVID-19. And there's still an average of around 2,000 deaths a day, with Brazil expecting to hit the sad mark of 500,000 deaths this week. The OMS has criticized the move. They said that the Brazilian government should be very careful about this. But last week, President Bolsonaro told his followers to stop wearing masks. So, as one delegation, the Venezuelan delegation, has already announced that 12 of its members have been diagnosed with COVID since arriving in Brazil, the worry is that this event is going to turn into a sad chapter in the history of Latin American football and transform into a COVID super spreader event taking place in cities across the country.
We thank Brian for that report. At least 13 players from the Venezuelan national football team have tested positive for COVID-19 a day before today's opening match of the Copa America against host Brazil. Brazilian Health Minister Marcelo Queiroga said that all players who test positive for coronavirus will be quarantined in Brazil.
All athletes who test positive will only leave Brazil after the quarantine and having the PCR exam negative, so that when these athletes return to their country, there is no risk of carrying any type of virus they get here in Brazil. The South American Football Confederation has changed the regulations and allows at any time the replacement of these athletes who test positive for COVID-19.
No Brasil, por exemplo.
For the third time, Santiago de Chile has entered a full lockdown since the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic to the country. More than 8 million residents living in and around the city must stay at home from Saturday, despite nearly 60% of the country being fully vaccinated. Immunized people who had the mobility pass issued by the authorities to circulate within their commune are excluded from these restrictions. This measure will be evaluated every week by the government. Just last week, Chile registered 45,500 new cases of COVID-19 and intensive care beds are near full capacity, according to health authorities.
I think it's excellent. The full lockdown because the pandemic is out of control. The government is garbage and has not been able to manage this since day one. So the vaccine will not save us. The vaccine does not prevent the contagion. It simply prevents hospitals from being overcrowded.
In Peru, indigenous leaders have demanded Pedro Castillo to be appointed as the country's next president after the dispute over the results of the presidential runoff. Leaders from indigenous communities representing almost 7 million people gathered as Castillo's supporters continue to rally outside his Peru Libre Party headquarters in Lima, hoping for an official announcement regarding the presidential elections. A group of 20 lawyers filed a lawsuit Friday against Keiko Fujimori for creating political turmoil and attempting against democracy.
I am sorry, if the Electoral Tribunal does not solve this, we will move forward with a position to fight. At the same time, we are going to move forward with a legal case to defend these votes, and we believe the popular will should be respected.
Enough of being stepped on. They have always stepped on our rights, just as they didn't when they sterilized indigenous women when her father was in the government. How many men and women leaders were killed and assassinated? We want no more of that. If you, Keiko Fujimori, say you love our country, that you love Peru, they've been dignified and say that you have lost. Yeah.
In the United States, the Congressional Progressive Caucus issued a statement expressing support for the democratic process in Peru. The movement stated that Pedro Castillo has maintained a lead over Keiko Fujimori and that her claims of fraud had not been supported with substantial evidence. It also underlines that Castillo has been widely recognized as the winner of the presidential elections. Bolivian and Peruvian authorities have joined forces to vaccinate the Aymara community living in the borderline of both countries. Dozens of people line up in the Desaguadero International Bridge to get the vaccine doses. Authorities estimate that more than 3 Aymara people live in the Andean region, which is shared by Bolivia, Peru, and Chile. The Desaguadero city, 100 kilometers west of the Bolivian capital La Paz, is an important crossing that has ceased some commercial activities during the past year by the COVID-19 pandemic. The initiative comes as Peru and Bolivia report a further surge in COVID-19 cases, which authorities believe is due to a new, more contagious variant of the virus.
Me siento bien.
I'm fine and I am cheerful. I want to ask of the people in Peru and Bolivia, as siblings we are, for all to get the vaccine for everyone to be protected against this illness. For this campaign, we have prepared 1,000 vaccines that are being delivered, but this is only a beginning. We will continue vaccination in the health centers.
After 46 days of protests against the Colombian government of Iván Duque, the students and human rights organizations rally outside the Attorney General's office in Bogota to demand answers regarding the persons reported as disappeared since the beginning of the national strike mobilizations. The groups call for the more than 300 disappearances to be investigated and for an end to impunity. They also demanded that the police agents involved in the murders of protesters be properly investigated. The moves comes after a delegation of Inter-American Commission on Human Rights finished its visit to the country, where it received testimonies and complaints from the victims of human rights violations, their families, and NGOs collecting data on the abuses. Ecuadorian indigenous groups have protested in the Cotopaxi province against increase in fuel prices. The indigenous leaders have called for the annulment of a fuel price increase decree introduced in 2020 during the government of former President Lenín Moreno. Fuel prices hikes in Ecuador has resulted in the rise in the cost of living. In 2019, the country's indigenous people led similar protests, which left 11 people dead, and later forced the Moreno government to backtrack on its first plan to raise the price of gasoline as part of an agreement with the International Monetary Fund.
For us, it is important that the incoming government, in this case, Guillermo Lasso, is sensitive to the Ecuadorian people and that we can no longer afford to spend 1 more cent on fuel increases.
Mexico has donated 400,000 doses of the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine to Belize, Bolivia, and Paraguay. Mexico makes this donation in its capacity as president pro tempore of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. However, the World Health Organization warned that despite promises of donations, the international COVAX system did not have enough vaccines for the months of June and July. COVAX is the mechanism by which a fair distribution of vaccines is sought and ensures that lower-income countries can have access to it.
400,000 doses of AstraZeneca vaccines that have been manufactured in Argentina and packaged and finished in our country.
Vamos a hacer 3 vuelos.
We are going to make 3 flights in fighter planes of the Mexican Air Force that are heading towards La Paz, Bolivia, towards Asunción, Paraguay, and towards Belize in Belize.
Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro demanded the United States government lift the sanctions that prevent the country from acquiring COVID-19 vaccines through the COVAX mechanism. The statement came after an international bank blocked a $10 million payment from Venezuela to the mechanism, saying it was under investigation.
What do you call that? Criminal theft, criminal sanctions, criminal actions of the United States of America against Venezuela. I demand today, June 11th, from Venezuela, that the government of Joe Biden cease its blockade of Venezuela's money for the COVAX vaccines.
And we have more stories coming up after one last break, so stay with us. Welcome back. Israel's parliament has voted in favor of a new coalition government ending Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's historic 12-year rule. Naftali Bennett, a former ally of Netanyahu turned rival, becomes prime minister, presiding over a diverse coalition conformed by 8 parties with deep ideological differences. Netanyahu remains the head of the Likud party and will hold the post of opposition leader. Sunday's vote, passed by a 60-59 margin, ended a two-year cycle of political paralysis in which the country held 4 elections. Hundreds of people celebrated in Jerusalem after the parliament vote on a coalition that ended Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's 12th consecutive year in charge. Over the past year, Netanyahu has been accused of several corruption charges, such as accepting improper gifts and seeking to trade favors with media moguls in exchange of a positive coverage. 7 people have been killed after 2 bombs hit 2 civilian vehicles in Afghanistan's capital, Kabul. The country's Interior Ministry reported that the attacks target the vehicles on the same road, about 2 kilometers apart, in a Shiite neighborhood in western Kabul. The first explosion killed 6 people and left 2 wounded. The second blast happened in front of the Muhammad Ali Hospital, where COVID-19 patients are currently admitted, and killed 1 and wounded 4 others. No one has immediately claimed responsibility of the attacks.
Unfortunately, a minivan was targeted by a bomb. When I got to the site, I saw 2 wounded victims and 4 dead bodies. We took the wounded victims to hospital.
Several people have been injured and dozens others arrested during anti-government protests in Nigeria's cities of Lagos and Abuja. Nigerian police fired tear gas to disperse the protesters who were demonstrating against bad governance and insecurity, as well as the recent Twitter ban by the government of President Muhammadu Buhari. Activists called for nationwide protests to be staged the same day when Nigeria was celebrating its Democracy Day, which marks Nigeria's move to civilian rule more than 20 years ago.
Lack of proper care, kidnapping, banditry, we can go on and on and on. So the people are protesting against a failed government. They are saying enough is enough. Who is the head of that government? It is the president. If the president cannot assure us, if we have even moved past the stage of assurances, if the president cannot swing into action and ensure that the lives of citizens are safeguarded, then he should resign.
Thousands have demonstrated in Burkina Faso to demand security from the government following last week's deadly terrorist attack. The demonstrators, who came from different parts of the country, marched in the city of Dori, blaming the government for not properly securing the area, resulting in continuing attacks by militants. At least 132 people had been killed last week by armed militants in the Sohan department. The demonstrators were organized several days ago by civil society organizations and local residents.
We came out to show our displeasure, the indignation that we are suffering. There have been so many solutions sought by the government, so many decrees, so many procedures. But so far, that does not prevent, here in the Sahel, our brothers and sisters from dying.
And Pope Francis has demanded humanitarian aid be delivered to residents of the war-torn Tigray region of northern Ethiopia. Speaking at his Sunday noon blessing, Francis said he was thinking of the people of Tigray who had been struck by a grave humanitarian crisis that has exposed the poorest to a famine. Francis also called for an immediate end to the fighting in Tigray, the return of social harmony, and for all food aid and health care to be guaranteed. The United Nations and social activist groups say that more than 350,000 people in Tigray are suffering famine, with millions more at risk of it.
It's not possible to close the eyes in front of the exploitation of children who are deprived of the right to play, to study, and to dream. According to the estimate of the International Labour Organization, today, the children exploited for labor are over 150 million. It's a tragedy. This is happening today. Many children are suffering because of this, to be exploited for child labor. Let's renew altogether the effort to eliminate this slavery of our times.
And with this, we come to the end of this news brief, but remember, you can find this and many other stories in our website at telesurenglish.net. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For TeleSUR English, I'm Jose Daniel Lopez. Thank you for watching.